Our topic tonight is Endgame, future approaches to the Iraqi crisis. Our guest, as you know, is Mr. Scott Ritter. I don't want to take up any time in making this introduction. I've had the wonderful opportunity to talk with Mr. Ritter for about an hour and a half this afternoon, and it's going to be a fascinating and wonderful evening. Just a couple of quick notes. He's a graduate of Franklin and Marshall, one of our neighboring institutions just to the north. He comes from a military family, spent his time traveling around the world as a youth. He was in the Marine Corps, of course, after graduation from Franklin and Marshall as an intelligence officer, an expert in ballistic missiles, stationed in the Soviet Union and the Middle East. He was served on a staff under General Schwarzkopf during Desert Storm, and as you all know, was one of our weapons inspectors and then one of our chief weapons inspectors after the Gulf War, and has received some attention because of his very straightforward and direct commentary upon our policy in Iraq. Now retired columnist for the New York Times, A.M. Rosenthal, remarked about not only the physical courage, but the intellectual and moral courage shown by Mr. Ritter, a dedicated and straightforward civil servant and military servant, public servant of the United States. I think it's going to be a most interesting evening. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you Mr. Scott Ritter.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It certainly is a pleasure to be here tonight and talk to you about Iraq. If you've been following the news, you would have seen that today the Security Council of the United Nations was supposed to vote on an omnibus resolution dealing with establishing Security Council policy about Iraq. The last I heard, the vote had been postponed at least until tomorrow because of the inability of the Council to get its hands around this very vexing and complicated problem. So it's not just this audience that's interested about Iraq, it is indeed truly an international issue of concern. What I'd like to do is talk to you for about 30 minutes about Iraq, about my experiences in Iraq, about some of the ideas that I have been a proponent of in terms of solving the problem of Iraq. Then I'm going to turn the floor over to you so you can hold me accountable for what I said, for my ideas. And hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions and concerns in a straightforward and coherent fashion. The problem of Iraq, as I said, is a very complicated one. What we're talking about today is how do we, the world community, get ourselves out of the morass that is the Iraqi problem. Today in Iraq, we have a situation that has been unchanged diplomatically since the implementation of Security Council resolutions in April of 1991, one, extending economic sanctions that were imposed on Iraq in August of 1990 when they invaded Kuwait, and two, calling for Iraq's disarmament of weapons of mass destruction. It is, of course, this disarmament which serves as the key to unlocking economic sanctions. If Iraq is found to be disarmed of its weapons of mass destruction, under the provisions of Security Council resolution, economic sanctions would be lifted and Iraq could be returned to a sense of normalcy, reinvited back into the family of law-abiding nations. That's the theory, but the practice is much more complicated. In April of 1991, the Security Council passed Resolution 687. This resolution required Iraq to be rid of its weapons of mass destruction. These weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, and long-range ballistic missiles used to deliver these weapons were determined by the Security Council to represent a clear and present risk to international peace and security. And even though Iraq had been evicted from Kuwait by Operation Desert Storm, the feeling in the world community was Iraq could not rejoin the community of nations until it was rid of these weapons. Therefore, economic sanctions would be continued as a means of compelling the government of Saddam Hussein to comply with Security Council resolutions calling for Iraq's disarmament. The Security Council created a unique body, the United Nations Special Commission, which was charged with overseeing the implementation of these disarmament provisions. Now, the task this body, this group of weapons inspectors was given early on was a very straightforward task. Iraq was called to provide a declaration of the totality of its holdings of weapons of mass destruction, its means of production, the weapons themselves, the components thereof. Iraq would provide this declaration. The United Nations would send in teams of weapons inspectors who would verify that these declarations were indeed full and complete, and then oversee the dismantling, disposal, rendering harmless of these weapons. A straightforward task, one that no one expected to take more than a few months. But from the very beginning, the weapons inspectors ran into a problem. The Iraqis submitted a false declaration. The Iraqis declared less than 50% of its holdings in ballistic missiles that were declarable. Iraq denied having a biological weapons program. Iraq denied having a nuclear weapons program. Iraq grossly underestimated or underdeclared its chemical weapons program. So when the inspectors went in, they found that this was much more than a simple verification task. The task had become one of being a detective, of hunting the truth. But hunting the truth in Iraq is a very difficult problem. You're dealing with a regime that is focused on total control of the state of Iraq, a regime that refuses to cooperate not only with the weapons inspectors, but with the provisions set out by the Security Council and its resolutions. In July or June of 1991, to give you an example of the kind of problems the weapons inspectors faced early on, a nuclear weapons team was in Iraq, hunting down or trying to verify declarations made by Iraq about its nuclear weapons program, or lack of a nuclear weapons program. Intelligence information was provided by the United States government, which pointed to the presence of around 100 vehicles in a military camp west of Baghdad. On these vehicles were boxes which the intelligence information said contained material related to Iraq's nuclear weapons program. Weapons inspectors were dispatched to the site and stopped at the point of a gun from entering the site, told you cannot come in. Even though they could see the crates of material over the walls, they were prohibited from going in. The Security Council was informed of this development and ordered the team return to Baghdad while the Council deliberated on what to do. The Council did deliberate, and within 24 hours, the team was sent back to this location. The Iraqis, of course, by this time having promised full cooperation. When the team returned, the site was evacuated. No boxes. Of course, the Iraqis allowed the team in. They said, where are the boxes? The Iraqis said, what boxes? There were never any boxes here. The team reported this event, went back to Baghdad. 2 days later, new intelligence information indicated the boxes had been moved to another facility, another 40 kilometers to the west. Once again, the weapons inspectors went to this site, surrounded the site. The Iraqis brought out the soldiers, physically prevented the inspectors from taking any action while the 100 vehicles left it through the rear of the facility. Fortunately, there was an intrepid inspector who got into a vehicle, circled around the Iraqi checkpoint, and followed the convoy, filming up close the contents of the trucks. The imagery taken by this inspector proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that Iraq had a very massive program for the enrichment of uranium for use in nuclear weapons. Inspections forced Iraq to admit the existence of a nuclear weapons program. It was a very successful operation, but one that was not envisioned when the weapons inspection process was created to begin with. UNSCOM was not supposed to be a search and destroy organization. UNSCOM was supposed to be a simple verification organization. Now you see the problem faced by weapons inspectors from the very beginning. How do we disarm a country that doesn't want to be disarmed? Basically, the key to success for the weapons inspectors is determined by the level of support that they would get from the Security Council. The Security Council passed the law. The Security Council created the weapons inspection teams to go in and implement the law, but it's up to the Security Council to enforce the law. The weapons inspectors are not an enforcement tool. They're an investigations tool. They're a verification tool, but they are not an enforcement tool. So when weapons inspectors go into Iraq and are confronted with Iraqi failure to comply, it's up to the Security Council to define the level of enforcement, or if indeed enforcement will be put in place. What the Security Council decided early on is that the issue of Iraq's retained weapons of mass destruction was not sufficient to justify a continuation of military action. There were members of the Security Council, specifically Russia, France, and China, who felt that this was a problem that could be solved diplomatically, not militarily. So weapons inspectors were sent back into Iraq. But this time the Iraqis had learned an important lesson. They weren't going to be called upon to pay a heavy price for obstructing the work of the weapons inspectors. So months went by, years went by. The weapons inspectors had their successes, they had their failures. And what we're able to prove over the course of the next 3 years is that, yes, Iraq had submitted false declarations. Yes, Iraq had lied on a massive scale about the scope of its weapons programs. But we were never able to get our hands on these weapons themselves. There were no dramatic victories by the weapons inspectors. The other problem, though, is as this process of inspections is going along, economic sanctions, which had been imposed on Iraq in August of 1990 and continued by the resolution of April 1991, were still in place. So while the inspectors played this complicated game of cat and mouse with the Iraqis in Iraq and with the Security Council back in New York, the people of Iraq continued to suffer under this huge burden of economic sanctions, a burden that we here in the United States cannot even begin to comprehend. Prior to 1990, prior to the implementation of economic sanctions, the mortality rate for children under the age of 5 in Iraq ran around 5,000 per year for the entire country. Iraq had very sophisticated medical facilities. Iraq was a very advanced nation. It had one of the highest literacy rates in the Middle East. Because of the effects, the combined effects of Operation Desert Storm, which devastated Iraq's industrial and social infrastructure, and economic sanctions, which have prevented Iraq from being able to reconstitute this infrastructure, today, 5,000 to 6,000 children under the age of 5 are dying every month as a result of economic sanctions. Malnutrition and disease derived from the fact that the Iraqis cannot repair their water purification plants. That even if medicines come into Iraq, they will deteriorate rapidly because there isn't enough electrical generation capability to power refrigeration systems needed to store these medicines. It's the people of Iraq who were suffering because of the Iraqi government's inability or unwillingness to comply with the resolutions calling for its disarmament, and the Security Council's inability to hold the government accountable. Economic sanctions were not holding the government of Iraq accountable for its obstruction of the inspection process. They were making the people of Iraq pay the price. By 1995, this was an intolerable situation. Something needed to be done. The Security Council was fractured deeply. There was no chance of getting consensus on the Security Council about decisive action vis-a-vis Iraq if we, the inspectors, continued along the path that we had been, uncovering one lie here, one lie there, because all we were doing by uncovering these lies was continuing a U.S. policy of containing Iraq. The United States determined early on that Iraq was not going to disarm. The United States also figured out that it was not going to be able to get the Security Council to unite around the concept of decisive military action against Iraq. So U.S. policy became one of using the continuation of economic sanctions as a means of containing Saddam Hussein in hopes that a strategy could be formulated to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Early on, that strategy was passive. By creating unrest in Iraq, by creating discontent in Iraq, somebody, somehow, an opposition group will rise from within Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein. That grossly underestimated the extreme level of security that exists in Iraq. There is no chance of an internal opposition group forming up in Iraq. So the next step was covert action on the part of the United States, intervening through the intelligence services, trying to create an opposition group. But this, too, failed miserably, led to the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of Iraqis who tried to rally around the cause of getting rid of Saddam Hussein. So the U.S. went back into defensive posture. While they tried to seek a means of getting rid of Saddam Hussein, they forwarded a policy of containment. Containment based on two principal pillars. First, continuation of economic sanctions. Through the continuation of economic sanctions, you deny Saddam Hussein control of his economy, and you prohibit or prevent reconstruction and reconstitution of the Iraqi economy and society. You effectively keep Saddam Hussein frozen in the state, in Iraq frozen in the state that they're in. The second tier is military containment. In 1991, the United States intervened politically and militarily to support the dire humanitarian situation that existed in southern and northern Iraq as a result of revolts that rose up in Iraq against the regime at the end of the Gulf War. One revolt was in southern Iraq amongst the primarily Shia population, the other revolt in the north. These revolts, of course, didn't succeed. The Iraqi government was able to respond with its considerable security forces and crush these revolts. They crushed them in a particularly brutal fashion, in a fashion which demanded some sort of action on the part of the world. In the north, we responded by sending in troops to create a safe haven. We patrolled that safe haven with aircraft, and we were able to get the Kurds out of the mountain, feed them, clothe them, and give them shelter. We created the northern no-fly zone. In the south, the Iraqi helicopters and jet fighters of their Air Force were very effective against Shia rebels, bombing convoys of civilians, etc. So what we did is we created a no-fly zone in the south, prohibiting Iraqi aircraft from flying down south, patrolling it with our own Air Force. But over the years, the humanitarian imperative of this intervention went away. And what the purpose and focus of this intervention became was of containing Saddam Hussein, but denying Saddam Hussein the ability to project his power into northern and southern Iraq, you in effect box Iraq and the government of Saddam Hussein into an area around the city of Baghdad. Policy of containment. This policy of containment would be sustained until which time the United States could get rid of Saddam Hussein, but they had no idea how to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Enter the Special Commission. In 1995, we determined that we needed to change the way we were doing business. The process of inspection that only succeeded in exposing Iraqi lies was going nowhere. We needed to do something new, something innovative. We determined that the Iraqis were running a concealment operation at the highest levels in Iraq, a concealment operation designed to retain documents, blueprints, components, materiel prohibited under Security Council resolution, which we were trying to look for. This concealment mechanism was run by the personal security forces of Saddam Hussein, directed by Saddam Hussein's presidential secretary. In order to uncover concealment, therefore, we had to investigate the forces of concealment, Saddam Hussein's personal security force. Now, in doing so, we were exposed to quite a bit of information, only a small percentage of which was directly related to our mandate towards disarmament. Most of what we found was related to the safeguarding and protection of the president of Iraq. But for the United States, this was a windfall of intelligence. For the first time, they're getting an insight into how Saddam Hussein is protected, how his security apparatus is organized. Weaknesses in the security structure of Iraq are being exposed. That is not the purpose of the weapons inspectors, but we had no choice but to undertake this if we were going to find out how they were concealing their weapons programs. So now you have a problem with the United States. What to do about these weapons inspectors? On the one hand, these weapons inspectors are causing problems. When Scott Ritter and a team goes into Iraq, there's a confrontation. That confrontation is brought back to the Security Council, and the Security Council is called upon to resolve this confrontation. In resolving this, it will require a debate and a discussion. What issues will be discussed in the Security Council? What is the level of Iraq's disarmament? In 1991, when UNSCOM started its work, Iraq had massive programs related to weapons of mass destruction. They had a chemical weapons manufacturing capability that was huge, a huge biological weapons capability, a nuclear and long-range ballistic missile program. By 1997, these programs had been destroyed, dismantled, or removed. Iraq no longer had a viable chemical weapons manufacturing capability. Iraq no longer had a viable biological weapons capability, nuclear weapons capability, long-range ballistic missile capability. If the Security Council debated in an open and honest forum the true level of Iraq's disarmament in 1997 and 1998, they would have no other choice but to say that Iraq is in effect disarmed. But under the provisions of Security Council resolution, Iraq has to be disarmed, Resolution 687, Iraq has to be disarmed 100%. The weapons inspectors have no latitude to determine what is the appropriate level of disarmament. If Iraq has a ballistic missile program, they have to account not only for the missiles, not only for the means of producing, but every component thereof. So if we have intelligence information that's accurate that says that Iraq retains guidance and control components related to long-range ballistic missiles, Iraq is not disarmed. We must report to the Security Council that components exist and we are seeking to find them out. That's what we do as inspectors. It's up to the Security Council to say enough is enough. And of course, the United States, with its policy of continuing economic sanctions, could not allow the Security Council to redefine Iraq's disarmament obligation. In addition to that, the longer the inspection process took place, the more intelligence was being collected about Saddam Hussein and his security. So the U.S. had to decide, what do we do about these weapons inspection teams? Do we let them continue their work, knowing that if they come up with this ultimate confrontation, we're going to face a problem in the Security Council? But if we curtail their work, we'll cut off this invaluable source of intelligence about Saddam Hussein and the way he's safeguarded. Now, as weapons inspectors, we're also in a quandary. If we continue these inspections, there will be a confrontation. Will we get the support we need from the Security Council? If we continue these inspections, we will continue to gather information that has nothing to do with our mandate, information that can and probably will be used by member states to fulfill their own purposes which are outside that of Security Council resolution. We opted to continue doing our work, and in the summer of 1998, the United States opted to intervene to stop us from doing our work. Not stop us in a decisive fashion, saying, don't go into Iraq, but stop us saying, don't create confrontation. We want you to go into Iraq. We want you to collect the intelligence that you've been collecting, but we want you to avoid confrontation. Stop doing inspections for the purpose of uncovering weapons of mass destruction. Continue doing inspections for the purpose of perpetrating the philosophy of Iraq as a non-compliant nation, thereby justifying the continuation of economic sanctions and collecting intelligence information which will be useful for the United States in achieving its stated objective in Iraq of regime removal. This is why I resigned. I could not allow myself to be put in such a situation. My job as a weapons inspector was to find weapons of mass destruction in accordance with the provisions set forth by Security Council resolutions. My job was not to facilitate the unilateral intelligence objectives of any member nation. If I wasn't allowed to go into Iraq and do my job, then there was no job for me to do, and I resigned. Now, when I resigned, many people thought that I was speaking out about the failure of the Security Council to rid Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. What I was saying, more accurately, was the failure of the Security Council to do its job, period. In passing its law to disarm Iraq, it's up to the Security Council to determine when enough is enough. We were trying to tell the Security Council that Iraq doesn't have weapons of mass destruction programs. They have components, they have blueprints, they have material, which in effect is so much junk as long as it's on the back of a truck being shuttled from one site to another site to another site. But they have no factories capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. It's up to the Security Council, therefore, to say either Iraq, you must get rid of all of the material, or enough is enough, it's time to move on. When I resigned, I spoke out that it's imperative, having passed a law calling for Iraq's disarmament, that the Security Council ensure that its credibility is not called into question, that this resolution be seen through to the end. That end can be one of two things. Iraq fully disarms, or the Security Council redefines Iraq's disarmament obligation. But the Security Council, in order to retain its credibility, had to undertake some sort of interventionist actions. It refused to do so. The United States stepped into the breach. In December of 1998, the United States used the weapons inspection process not to further disarmament of Iraq, but rather to trigger military intervention, used an inspection, UNSCOM 258, as a means of justifying the initiation of aerial attacks on Baghdad, Operation Desert Fox. When the United States did this, they destroyed the credibility of Security Council Resolution 687. No longer could the world body stand up and say, we have a law and it's a good and just law. What the Iraqis could do now is say, you had a law that was misused for purposes other than set forth by the Security Council resolution. And that's the situation where we are today. Weapons inspectors out of Iraq. The law set forth by the Security Council calling for Iraq's disarmament, disgraced. No longer effective, no longer believable. The Security Council scrambling for a solution. Economic sanctions still imposed. The people of Iraq suffering horribly. Where do we go? What do we do? Current U.S. policy calls for no resolution to this problem until which time Saddam Hussein is removed from power. It is a stated policy that sanctions will not be lifted until Saddam Hussein is removed from power. But if you check the Security Council resolutions, you will not find any text that talks about this linkage. The linkage is plain and simple. Iraq is disarmed, economic sanctions are lifted. But if you lift economic sanctions, the whole process of containing Saddam Hussein starts to deteriorate. So the U.S. doesn't want sanctions lifted. What you see taking place in the Security Council today isn't a resolution about disarming Iraq. It's a resolution about continuing economic sanctions. The Russians, French, and Chinese have raised important questions, questions which I've tried to allude to here. What level is enough when talking about determining Iraq's disarmament obligation? What is enough? What is it Iraq has to do? Russia wants the resolution to be very specific about what it is the Iraqis have to achieve. The United States and Great Britain want the resolution to be very vague. Why? Having passed the resolution, the United States and Great Britain can then continue to raise the goalpost in terms of Iraq's obligation. Iraq will never be able to be disarmed to meet the requirements of the United States government. Therefore, economic sanctions can be continued until Saddam Hussein is removed from power. How does the United States plan on removing Saddam Hussein from power? They passed the Iraq Liberation Act, public law, calling for the provision of $100 million to an Iraqi opposition group. But this opposition group, having just had a recent conference in New York, is incapable of coming together as a political entity, yet alone forming some sort of viable military opposition to Saddam Hussein. So we have no resolution to the problem. Or do we? How do we solve the problem in Iraq? It's clear the policies of confrontation being perpetrated by the United States aren't going to work. We don't have the means or the will to physically overthrow Saddam Hussein. But what we've done is define the problem so that the only resolution is by getting rid of Saddam Hussein. I propose that we start looking at Iraq in a different fashion. We have demonized a man at the expense of a nation. Saddam Hussein is not the problem. Iraq is the problem. How do we solve the problem with Iraq? The first thing is to understand that Iraq has met its disarmament obligation from a qualitative standpoint. Qualitatively, Iraq is disarmed. Quantitatively, no. There are still components, bits and pieces missing. Having determined that Iraq has met its disarmament obligation, we then must seek to secure the peace and security of Iraq for the greater benefit of the region and of the world. How do we do that? Through diplomatic and economic engagement. I believe that economic sanctions should be lifted. I believe that the world should unite and form some sort of Marshall Plan for the reconstitution and revitalization of the Iraqi economy. Unlike a Marshall Plan for areas such as the Balkans, Iraq can pay for its own revitalization. It's sitting on one of the world's largest proven reserves of oil. They just need a helping hand up. Now, some people would say that this is a policy of appeasement, that you're only rewarding Saddam Hussein for obstructing the work of the United Nations. I say if you want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, lift economic sanctions. Why? It's simple. Saddam Hussein has turned sanctions around in the mindset of the Iraqi people. They do not hold him accountable for what's happening in Iraq. They hold the Security Council accountable. They hold the United States accountable. They believe that when sanctions are lifted, Saddam Hussein will be able to revitalize the Iraqi economy. He has no choice but to revitalize the Iraqi economy. The expectations are so high. Lift sanctions, make Saddam Hussein focus on the revitalization of the economy. In doing so, you will create a revolution in the society and the economy of Iraq, unlike any we have seen in the past 40 years. This revolution will redefine Iraqi society along the lines which are more adept towards the promotion of democratic values. It won't be instantaneous, but it is a long-term vision about where we want to be with Iraq. Do we want to be positioned with an Iraq that has a devastated economy, an alienated population, and still is viewed by nations in the region as a threat to regional security? Or do we want to deal with Iraq, which has a defined position in the region, Iraq, which is a partner in terms of economic and security prosperity in the region? That's the vision that I think we should be looking towards developing with Iraq, positioning ourselves to attain it with Iraq. It requires us breaking from the current policies that we have. But again, I put forward, I submit to you, that our policies as we are implementing today are a failure. They have failed. They have no chance of succeeding. In order to succeed, we must break free, redefine our objectives, and come up with a policy which focuses on diplomatic engagement and economic engagement. It's a challenge I put forward to you. Now what I'm going to do is step back and hold myself accountable for these positions. Thank you.
Thank you for a clear description of events and a clear statement of purpose. Question is, why couldn't you have traded off the return of prisoners of war, Iraqi prisoners, for Saddam being turned over for trial?
Again, the coalition had been created for the purposes of liberating Kuwait. To get an international criminal tribunal set forth, you need consensus at the Security Council level. This would have required a debate amongst the Security Council, which would have sought to define Saddam Hussein as a war criminal. There was no way you were going to get the Russians, French, and Chinese to agree to that kind of definition. The United States cannot unilaterally declare somebody to be a war criminal and expect the international community to prosecute him under some sort of tribunal. Well, that's one of the problems that we're facing today is there is a great movement underfoot, the Indict movement, trying to indict Saddam Hussein and senior Ba'ath Party officials as war criminals. But in order to do that, not only do you have to make a case that the war crimes were committed, I think that's an easy case to make, but you have to get the international body, i.e. the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, to agree on an indictment, and that will never happen, not as long as we're where we're at today.
The premise is that Saddam Hussein is the problem. The question is, should we have done everything we could during the end of the war to eliminate Saddam?
One of the problems is in removing Saddam, what next? What's the next step? I think we have to go beyond defining Saddam as the problem and understand what Saddam Hussein is. Saddam Hussein is a member of a Sunni tribal group from Tikrit. The Sunni Muslims of Iraq are a minority of the Iraqi population. The majority is Shia, and there's a considerable Kurdish minority. And yet the Sunnis hold power in Iraq. The Sunnis have dominated Baghdad, and they have dominated Iraq since Iraq has been a modern state at the end of World War I. Why is that? It's because the Sunnis have the money. The Sunnis also were aligned with the British, and the Sunnis were given the reins of power. The Sunnis, the tribal coalition that Saddam Hussein has created out of Tikrit is a very complicated tribal coalition in which he plays off one tribal group against another. And it's not just the Sunnis that he's done this, it's the Kurds and the Shias. In the South, when you had the Great Revolt in March of 1991, people like to believe that the entire Shia population rose up against Saddam Hussein. By some accounts, over 70% of the Shia tribes were allied with Saddam, never broke with Saddam Hussein. There was a minority of the Shias that rose up. What am I saying here? That Saddam is a phenomena that's more than just one man. Saddam Hussein is reflective of greater social and cultural issues in Iraq. If we didn't have Saddam Hussein, we'd have someone just like him. Getting rid of Saddam Hussein doesn't solve the problem because he will be replaced with someone just like him unless we do something to change the balance of power. Could we have gone in and killed Saddam Hussein? It's problematical. But having killed him, what would we do? If we kill him and enough of his senior leaders and disrupt this tribal alliance that he's created to sustain Sunni power in Baghdad, we open up to the possibility of Shias taking over. You have great fear in many nations of the Gulf Coast country, of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others, about a Shia-dominated Iraq, given the Islamic fundamentalist nature of the Iranian regime next door. The Kurds move down and take over Baghdad. Believe me, the Turks, the Syrians, the Iranians would never allow the Kurds to achieve that kind of dominant position. Right now, until Iraq is redeveloped socially, you're dealing with the reality of a Sunni minority governing Iraq. And a Sunni minority governing Iraq requires a strong-handed dictator. A strong-handed dictator will be named Saddam Hussein, or he'll be named something else. But that's my point. Saddam's not the problem. Iraq is the problem. And we need to come up with a policy that deals with Iraq as a reality. And if we want to change this Iraqi reality, we need to talk in a visionary way about transforming Iraqi society. We're in a position today where we can do that. Right now, many people judge Iraq based upon a model that was formed in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Iraq, a powerful economy. Iraq, a powerful military. Iraq, a leader who wanted to be a regional, who wanted regional dominance. View Iraq today in a model of 1999 and you get a completely different picture. Iraq's military is incapable of projecting its power outside of its own borders. The Iraqi economy is devastated. The social infrastructure of Iraq has been devastated. The tribal alliances have been restructured in a way that they're very fragile at the moment. Saddam Hussein and the system that put Saddam Hussein in power is weaker now than it's ever been. If you engage Iraq diplomatically, you engage Iraq economically, you do have a chance of transforming Iraqi society in a way that the leader of Iraq will not be a Sunni dictator, but rather maybe somebody who's more reflective of democratic norms and values. That's why I propose that rather than continuing policies which only further entrench Saddam Hussein, we instead seek a new path that has a vision on how do we position ourselves with Iraq and how do we position Iraq with the region so that we have true peace and security.
The assertion is, or the proposition is, that if you were to rebuild Iraq now, the first thing they would, or help Iraq, or take off the sanctions, the first thing they would do is build up their military and invade their neighbors.
Again, I would say that that's based upon a model of 1990. In 1990, Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world. One of the reasons why they had this large military is they just finished fighting an 8-year war with Iran. a war that required Iraq to go from an army of around 150,000 people to an army of over 1.5 million people. Now, the economic reality of 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war ended, was such that you could not demobilize these troops and reinsert them into the Iraqi economy without creating havoc on the Iraqi economy. So Saddam Hussein had to keep this army in place, in position, funded. He had no other choice. When the economy of Iraq deteriorated in the summer of 1990, they had a huge debt load brought on by the Iran-Iraq war. A debt load sustained by the fact that Iraq continued to build and spend billions of dollars on developing weapons of mass destruction. Iraq continued to develop. You said Iraq is a modern nation. They are a modern nation. They were a modern nation. Iraq had, if you go to Iraq, you'll see Iraq has wonderful highways, which Germans would be proud to drive on these highways in Iraq. Iraq has a train system could stand up to European standards. Iraq had water purification plants, which would have been the envy of many European cities. Iraq was a very modern state. Saddam Hussein is to blame for this. Saddam Hussein is the man who helped push Iraq into this advanced state. He did so because he had total control of the Iraqi economy, total control of the Iraqi population. He did so because he brooked no opposition. But the fact of the matter is, Saddam built the institutions of higher education. He built the medical institutions. Saddam cares about Iraq. He cares about it in a way that maybe isn't comprehensible to democratic-oriented people. But Saddam believes that Iraq is a great nation. And Saddam invested a considerable amount of Iraq's economic potential into building Iraq as a modern state. He will continue to do so. That is a statement of fact. The other problem, though, or one reason why the model of 1990 doesn't work, is this army of 1.5 million people was destroyed decisively during the Gulf War. And Iraq, as it has faced the realities of the military defeat and of the economic sanctions, has reduced its military and is actually seeking to form a more professional military, a smaller military. So when you talk about an Iraqi military that's going to push into its neighbors, the military today cannot do that. The level of expenditure required to transform Iraq's defeated military into a military capable of projecting its force is extremely high and is not sustainable if Saddam Hussein has to rebuild his economy. We're dealing with a new system in Iraq, a new set of realities. And the realities are the number one priority for Iraq is economic reconstitution. Lower on the priorities will be building a military capable of projecting power. And believe me, if you engage Iraq diplomatically and economically, you remove some of the impetus for Iraq to rebuild its military in a manner which allows it to project its power. Iraq will seek to invade its neighbors if it feels it's at risk. But by rebuilding Iraq, by getting its economy revitalized, and by making it an important player in the region, Iraq will be prospering. Why would Iraq want to move on Kuwait, or move on Iran, or move on Saudi Arabia? The reasons for doing so in 1990 were because Iraq was facing economic collapse and Iraq felt threatened. Those reasons won't exist if we have a policy of engagement that seeks constructive rebuilding of the Iraqi society and the Iraqi economy.
The question is there a contradiction in your position? Did you resign because you felt that we had to get rid of his arms potential, and now you place your emphasis upon a form of diplomatic and economic accommodation with Saddam?
When I resigned, I was a weapons inspector. A weapons inspector's task is to implement provisions of Security Council resolutions calling for Iraq's disarmament. The resolutions offer no latitude for a weapons inspector or any member of UNSCOM to determine the appropriate level of disarmament of Iraq. It's 100%. Now, as a weapons inspector, I cannot differentiate between a force of 30 ballistic missiles tipped with chemical warheads that's being hidden in the desert ready to fire missiles, rain missiles down on Tel Aviv, and a truckload of guidance and control equipment being shuttled from one farm to the other. According to the resolution, both are illegal, both are prohibited, and both must be stopped. By 1998, when I resigned, we weren't talking about a force of ballistic missiles ready to rain death and destruction on Iraq's neighbors. We're talking about a truckload of guidance and control components. We weren't talking about a nuclear weapons manufacturing capability ready to pump out bombs so they could obliterate Tel Aviv and Riyadh and Tehran. We were talking about truckloads of components that, if assembled and if functioned properly, would give Iraq 3 or 4 nuclear weapons minus the fissile core. As a weapons inspector, it's not my job to say, well, we've done enough. It's the Security Council's job to say we've done enough. When I resigned, I confronted the Security Council and the United States with the reality that the law that they passed called for 100% disarmament. And as a weapons inspector, we were charged with implementing that. And we were not being allowed to do our job. Now, I didn't want to get political at that point in time. What I was saying is you passed a law, either enforce the law or change the law. One or the other. But don't continue going down this middle path because it's going nowhere. That's not our job isn't to be a tool of the United States to continue economic sanctions against the Iraqi people. Our job is to disarm Iraq. And the United States was not allowing us to do that job. They were stopping the weapons inspection teams from going in and trying to find these hidden components. Why? Because in doing so, in creating a confrontation around the search for hidden components, the Security Council would be called upon to take action if Iraq obstructed us. In the ensuing debate, the reality of Iraq's disarmament level would be brought out. That we're not talking about a force of hidden missiles. We're not talking about a force of hidden chemical weapons. We're talking about components, blueprints, drawings, junk, meaningless. Something that cannot sustain the continuation of economic sanctions that are killing 5,000 to 6,000 kids a month. But I didn't make that statement at the time. I said, you made a law, either enforce it or change it. Now, in December of 1998, the United States took it a step further. They said, we don't care about the law. We're going to use the weapons inspection programs as a means of justifying military action that is not sanctioned by the Security Council, unilateral military action. This military action was not undertaken for the purpose of getting rid of weapons of mass destruction. That's what we were told. Study closely the target deck. You'll find that the vast majority of targets struck during Operation Desert Fox pertain to the security of Saddam Hussein, and that these targets were developed as a result of the intelligence operations undertaken by my team over the course of 2 years. That information was misused. It was supposed to be used for the purpose of disarming Iraq, not getting rid of the regime. The United States is the one who corrupted the process of disarming Iraq set forth by Security Council resolution. In doing so, rip up the resolution, rip up the law. It no longer is enforceable. It no longer is applicable. We no longer have the moral authority to insist that Iraq comply with it because we haven't complied with it. So now we have to seek a new way. And what I'm saying with that new way is, having made 687 null and void, pass a new resolution which redefines Iraq's disarmament obligation along qualitative terms, not quantitative terms, and also seek to engage Iraq in a constructive fashion which seeks to find a way out of the current morass that we exist, a way that's beneficial not only to the people of Iraq, but to the people of the region and the people of the world.
Would you comment on the fact and difficulties of dealing with people who supply Iraq?
Well, part of the United Nations disarmament mandate in Iraq is more than just finding the weapons and verifying they've been disposed of. A large part of it was supposed to be monitoring Iraq's compliance. A part of this monitoring was what we called the export-import control regime, in which anything that's brought into Iraq has to be done so under the strict supervision of the United Nations. That way, if Iraq sought to import material which had direct application to ballistic missiles guidance and control, the nation that was importing it or exporting it would have to declare it to the United Nations. Iraq would have to declare they're importing it, and we would monitor it into Iraq, monitor how it was being used, etc. Any violation of that would be illegal, and if we detected it and we were setting up a regime of detecting this kind of violation, then that material would be subject to destruction by the Special Commission. Some people say, well, that's a pipe dream. The UN would never be able to achieve that kind of watchdog status. In 1995, I led a team into Jordan where we intercepted a shipment of 180 ballistic missile guidance and control components being shipped from Russia into Iraq in contravention of Security Council resolution. We had a very effective intelligence apparatus in place to collect information to ensure that we were monitoring any effort by Iraq to deviate from its disarmament obligation. That wasn't the problem. The problem was, how do we get to the point where we can fully implement the monitoring regime? You can't implement a monitoring regime until Iraq has been declared disarmed. You can't monitor an incomplete set. We needed to determine what the set was we were monitoring and then go on with monitoring. And only the Security Council can define that for the weapons inspectors, and it had not done so in a sufficient fashion.
In terms of models, the model which was proposed is 1970, when Iraq was prosperous and was not under a dictatorship such as that of Saddam. Well, it was, I'm sorry, and he did all kinds of things. The image, though, is that you could have I think there are two images. One, what makes you think that a current, prosperous and vigorous Iraq would automatically result in a more democratic regime when in 1970 you didn't have a more democratic regime? And I think the second inference is that what makes you think that...
Saddam and not Saddam
That's right.
is the problem, and not the fact that there were Shia and Sunni and Islamist control. He is a very new phenomenon in the entire history of Iraq.
In short, Saddam's the problem, and would you comment on that?
One, first thing is, I am not up here in defense of Saddam Hussein. Let's make this point very clear. He's a brutal dictator. He's an evil man. He's a man who's responsible for the deaths of thousands of Iraqis, innocent Iraqis. And there's no way that I'm going to sit up here and say that Saddam Hussein is worthy of any kind thoughts from anybody in this audience. He's worthy of our disgust. He's a despicable character. He's the ruler of Iraq. We have to deal with that reality because we've been unable to alter that reality. And we don't seem to have a plan in place that can succeed in getting rid of Saddam Hussein. Why does Saddam Hussein do what he did in the 1970s? Because Saddam Hussein is a student of Iraqi history. He was a member of the Ba'ath Party. Saddam Hussein was part of a group of people who plotted to overthrow regimes in Iraq. If you study the history of Iraq, you'll see that there's one coup after another coup after another coup after another coup, changing governments. There was never democracy in Iraq. There was always one government overthrowing another, overthrowing another. And Saddam Hussein, as a terrorist, as an assassin, as a man responsible for overthrowing governments, knew that was the reality of Iraqi society. So when he came in, he said, never again. Saddam Hussein was arrested for plotting to overthrow. He went to jail. He left jail. He succeeded in being part of a Ba'ath Party uprising in 1968, which ousted a government. Saddam said, that will never happen again. If I arrest somebody who's plotting against me, he will never leave my jail. I'm going to kill him. I'm not just going to kill him, but I'm going to kill his family. I'm going to terrorize these people who oppose me so that there is no opposition. Am I defending this? No. But it's a reality of Iraq. It's the reality of Saddam Hussein. It's the reality of the people that surround Saddam Hussein. There has not been a coup in Iraq since 1968. Why? Because Saddam Hussein has an iron grip on Iraq. And nothing our policies are doing today are going to remove this iron grip. In fact, by continuing a policy of economic sanctions, we're just strengthening Saddam's grip on Iraqi society. How do we break this grip? Saddam Hussein's in his mid-60s. He's not going to last forever. We cannot wait until Saddam Hussein's demise to start formulating an effective approach to dealing with Iraq. We must have a vision where we want to be with Iraq in the years to come. And we must start implementing that vision today. And I put forward that the best way to implement this vision is to lift economic sanctions and expose Saddam Hussein to a new kind of pressure that he's never felt before. The absolute requirement to rebuild his economy, devastated by years of economic sanctions and military action. That's his number one priority. He has no other recourse. And in doing so, there will be a revolution in Iraq society which will cause the beginning of democratic values, the democratization of Iraq, privatization of industry. That will undermine the kind of dictatorial authority that Saddam Hussein and whoever may follow after him has over Iraq.
Are there any implications, or what are the implications of the policy you would suggest on Iraq for Korea, North Korea?
Well, I don't want to stand up here today and put myself as a North Korean expert, because I'm not. I know as much about North Korea as most of you in the audience by what I read in the newspapers. North Korea is a product, again, of its own history. I think that, trying to take the Iraqi model and cover North Korea and say it has to fit is wrong. North Korea is North Korea. North Korea exists because of World War II, because of Cold War politics at the end of World War II, because of the Korean War, because of the United States' effort to contain communism in the Pacific. North Korea also exists because of it being propped up by the Russians, or by the Soviet Union, by communist China. You now have the demise of the Soviet Union. They're not getting the money in from the Soviet Union that they had. Their economy is deteriorating. They have no other choice to derive income other than selling missiles to Iran. There's a lot of realities going on in North Korea today that have to be factored in when coming up with a policy. One thing that they both have in common is that the United States nor any of the regional neighbors they lack the will to solve the problem militarily, nor do I believe they should. I mean, some people say, we have to get rid of that regime in North Korea. How do you do that? Invade North Korea? And how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives would be lost? The same thing in Iraq. Get rid of Saddam Hussein. The opposition has no chance of succeeding. If you want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, it will require massive military intervention on the part of the United States. This means American servicemen, American servicewomen would be put in harm's way and will die as a result. There isn't a hue and cry in the United States or abroad for this kind of intervention. They both require diplomatic solutions. In North Korea, we have engaged diplomatically with the North Koreans. We have made compromises in an effort to engage the North Koreans, to bring them towards, to the forefront. I say, why not do the same thing with Iraq?
It's past the witching hour. I was going to say that as one with coming from a military family and years of military service, Mr. Ritter would understand the idea that we have to end promptly at 7:10. However, I realized as I thought of that at the beginning of the Republic, everyone's going to go to a great banquet, and Socrates begins to speak, and nothing is said about eating again. And I rather suspect that Mr. Ritter's interest in the truth would be such that he would gladly stay with us for many hours more to pursue these questions. We can't yield to the Socratic impulses within Mr. Ritter, and so we have to end the program. And I know a lot of you still had questions, but I know you want to thank Mr. Ritter for what was really quite a spectacular evening.